Welcome to the course. This is our first presentation for the course, just a quick introduction to the material. And before I jump into the material, I just want to talk a little bit about the course. This is certainly all reflected in Blackboard, but I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page that this course is basically a survey course in information security. So we're going to talk about all the different topics within information security. You'll hear me frequently throughout the course talk about other courses that you could take that cover some of this material in much more detail. So we'll talk about some topics very vaguely or broadly, and you can learn much more depth and detail about those topics in other courses. So, for example, in this course, we might talk about risk management for one week. Certainly, that's a very involved topic that you could take an entire course about. And in fact, you can take an entire course about risk management here at Drexel University. So you'll frequently hear me talk about that, but I just want to give you some sense of the goal of this course, that it's to expose students to all of the different topics and all of the different areas of information security and give you kind of a broad understanding of all of these different topics. To that end, there are going to be exercises that reinforce some of the information that we cover in the course. You'll find two types of exercises. There will be written assignments where I'll be presenting some sort of scenario and using what we discussed in the course between the presentations and what you read in the textbook and the discussion threads. Using some of that background, you're going to respond to that scenario with some questions that I'm going to ask each week. There's also going to be practical assignments. Practical assignments are a little bit more objective. So where the written assignments are more subjective, where you're kind of giving your opinion and supporting it by looking at the things that we talk about in that unit. The more objective assignment, which is the practical assignment, you're going to really more answer the question. So I'm going to ask you specific questions which you're going to answer. So a little bit different, more of a typical sort of quiz-like scenario. And then there are, speaking of quizzes in this course as well. So each week there'll be a quiz. So you'll see those each week. And of course a midterm and a final as well. Some of those practical assignments are also going to be hands-on. So I'll give you instructions on how to complete some hands-on assignment. You will complete that assignment and then answer questions about it. So I'll give you step-by-step instructions, and these will be IT security related. But it's important to note that this is not a highly technical class. We're certainly going to talk about technical subjects. Some of the practical assignments will be hands-on and will involve some practical skills from other courses perhaps. But don't worry if you haven't taken a Linux class yet, or you haven't taken a Windows class yet, or if you're just taking this class to learn a little bit about IT security. My labs do walk you through step-by-step a lot of the steps. So again, kind of a little bit of a mix of some technical hands-on, a lot of thought exercise in this course, and the written and practical assignments. So let's get started as we discuss information security. What we're going to do in this unit is sort of level set everyone on some of the concepts of information security. We're going to define what information security is. We're going to talk about a little about the background of information security, where it comes from, some of the vernacular, what some of the different ways that people attack our systems are, and what our vulnerabilities and threats to information systems are, and who protects those systems. So we'll talk about the people that protect information systems. And again, that should orient all of us to information security and what we're going to set the table with to cover for the rest of the quarter. So first, let's talk a little bit about the history of information systems. It's important to know where information systems came from to understand how we've evolved with IT security to where we are today. And if we go back in time to the 1960s during the Cold War, there was a need for sharing information in the Defense Department through reliable networks. And to that end, DARPANET was developed by the Department of Defense, which later became ARPANET, which was officially launched in, I believe, around 1968. So ARPANET came first, and there were computers prior to ARPANET and prior to the 1960s. You know, the ENIAC was developed in the 1940s in World War II, so we certainly had computers before that, but IT security was not a huge concern yet because, number one, it took highly technical people to operate computers in those days until the 1960s. And even in the 1960s, it was mostly very technical people operating computers. And also, they were not generally networked. They were not generally connected to each other until we had ARPANET in the 1960s. So ARPANET really brought this capability of different computer systems communicating with each other. And that really opened the door to some of the concerns that we talk about today in modern information systems. So it's kind of where everything is rooted in that, beginning with ARPANET. In the 1970s, there was a realization that we had a need for security. In the 1960s, things were very open. And when I say the 60s, this was all very late 60s, like 1968, 69. So there was kind of this honeymoon phase of networks and computer systems where everybody kind of trusted everyone. It was such a small community, and there was a lot of goodwill in that community. So people weren't terribly concerned about these things. But starting in the 1970s, these little signs of the need for IT security started bubbling up to the surface. One early example is a system administrator. There's a famous story about a system administrator on a multi-use system, on a Multic system, who was editing the message of the day, which is when a user logs into a system. In the old days with the console, you would have a console and you would log in. Some of you are going to see that in this quarter because we're going to use the console on a Unix system at Drexel to do some exercises. But when you logged into a system, you would get a message of the day. It was a banner that basically told you something that day. Sometimes it would be a quote, sometimes it's an announcement about something. But a system administrator was editing that, and there was another system administrator in a different user account, a different user space, that was editing a password file. So updating passwords for users. And back in those days in the 70s, things were definitely a little bit more primitive than they are today. So two people were editing these files. Somehow they got mixed up. When users logged in, instead of getting the message of the day, somebody accidentally made the password file the message of the day. So if you think about it, if the password file, which basically contains all the usernames and passwords for the system, and back in those days, by the way, the passwords are stored in plain text, not like today where we encrypt everything with one-way hashes, which we'll learn about in week 8. So back in those days, it was all plain text. So every time a user logged in, their message of the day was a list of everyone's passwords. And then that got everybody thinking that if I know somebody else's password, then what can I do? What sort of nefarious things can I do on the system? I could edit files and it would look like someone else did it. So it kind of started to wipe away the innocence of these systems when incidents like that started to happen. And people really started in earnest to start developing security protocols and security best practices and policies and things of that nature. Fast forward to the 1980s. So the earlier work in the 70s continues, but by the 1980s we had Unix operating systems, which were very powerful. They were all sharing data on networks all around the world. Already the internet started taking off. We didn't have the World Wide Web yet, but we had the internet. We had all kinds of collaboration happening with these Unix systems. Some of them were operating as routers and so forth and so on. Again, it was the early implementations of the internet as we know it today. But those systems really brought forth a lot of the security concerns that we think about today with modern information systems. And this is an early graphic that shows, and this is from CNNS, but this is an early graphic that talks about some of the vulnerabilities that we have in computer networks and the things that we have to worry about. And you'll see that a lot of the things in this graphic really reflect some of the same concerns we have today. Even some of this stuff is a little bit low level when you look at radiation, which is basically being able to pick up the signals from a wire and crosstalk, which would affect availability, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But a lot of these concerns still today are still concerns. So again, a lot of this started solidifying in the early to mid 1980s. And then fast forward to the 1990s. This is where when you go into around 1995, 96. The internet and the World Wide Web existed then much the same way as it exists today. Obviously, we have newer protocols today. We have newer technologies today. Things are a lot faster. We have better hardware. But the environment that we had, the technological underpinnings that we had in the 1990s really exist today and support what we have today as well. And one of the things that you'll see that was first developed in the 1990s that really kind of moved security ahead are things like IPsec, which was sort of the modern suite of encryption protocols that we use today. And we're going to talk much more about encryption in week 8. So we'll talk more about how that works, and we'll talk about why that's important and so forth and so on. In any event, before we can really talk about security, it's important to understand and define the term security. And in the traditional sense, security is a protection from our adversaries. That is the definition if you were to go look up in a dictionary what security is. It's protection from adversaries. In IT security, it's not only the protection from adversaries or protecting our information and the critical elements of information systems, which are things like your hardware that stores, transmits, and uses information. Not only is it that, but it's also protecting the people. It's protecting, all of the things that support information technology, but also making sure that information is available. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So when we think about security, IT security, it is literally protection from adversaries, be they people, software, or natural disasters and so forth and so on, no matter where that threat comes from, protecting our anything that supports the storage, transmission, and usage of information. So anything that would fall in the category of storing, transmitting, and using information falls under IT security. In any IT security class that you would take, probably in just about any university or college in the country, one of the first things they'll talk about is the CIA triad. And of course, CIA, we're not referring to the Central Intelligence Agency here. We are talking about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Those are the three sides of the CIA triad, or the triangle of IT security. Usually in textbooks, they'll show you a triangle, and each side of the triangle is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. If we were in a face-to-face class, I would probably ask each one of you to try to tell me what confidentiality, integrity, and availability is, and they're important concepts to understand. So confidentiality is protecting our data and making sure that only those who should have access to data have access to it. So that's confidentiality. And when most people think of IT security, probably the simplest example that most people understand and most people think of is confidentiality. That's what most people think of when they think of IT security, making sure that only I have access to my files and that people who should not have access to my files don't have access to it. So that's the basic example for IT security. But the other two are important as well. Integrity is making sure that we can trust our data. So integrity is all about trust. We're going to talk about different mechanisms that enhance trust later on in the course. We'll talk about different protocols that help us do that and tools that can help us do that. But integrity is all about trust. In other words, we want to trust that we know who sent the data. We want to make sure that we can trust the person that sent the data, that it wasn't some bad actor that was sending us the data pretending to be somebody else. We want to make sure the data was not modified between the time it left the person that's sending us the information to the time that we look at that information. We want to make sure it's the same thing. Again, there's lots of tools we have to help facilitate that. And then finally, availability, which is access to that data, being able to use that data and use information systems, access to our networks, to our computer systems, being able to get access to our data to see our customer records, for example. So availability is also an extremely important part of IT security, and one that I think a lot of people forget about in IT security, and we'll talk more about that later on and why that might be. So some of the things that support confidentiality, integrity, and availability, there's three pillars of IT security, or three, I don't want to say pillars, three sort of divisions in IT security. You have computer security, then data security, and finally network security. So those three support confidentiality, integrity, and availability. In fact, everything we talk about in this course will almost always tie back to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We'll almost always talk about, so when I'm talking about a topic, in many cases I'll talk about, if it makes sense, I'll talk about how it affects confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And again, these are the three areas of IT security that support that. In any IT security implementation, we have policies. Policies define how we use the technologies, protocols, and tools in order to achieve confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So again, a policy codifies the methods, the tools, the techniques, and the technology that we have available to implement in order to achieve that goal of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And then resting upon the policies is management of information security, which is typically creating those policies and defining and tweaking those policies and so forth. And then some of the tools available to management would be the Information Security Department and, of course, governance, which enforces IT security policies. So you have governance, which ensures that we're following the policies, and the policies implement IT security using the tools and techniques to achieve the goal of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So some of the vernacular in IT security that you will see in our textbook and in general, they'll talk about access, being able to access systems, assets, which is anything that we have to protect. That could be data, could be systems, could be software. So those are all assets. An attack is when someone is trying to gain access to systems or trying to somehow circumvent that confidentiality, integrity, or try to prevent the availability to IT resources. Controls, safeguards, and countermeasures are those techniques and tools that I talked about that we can use to achieve those confidentiality, integrity, and availability goals. We're going to talk about all that stuff in this course. An exploit is anything that allows an attacker to basically get access to those systems or to get around the confidentiality and availability and integrity measures that we're putting in place. Exposure is basically very similar to an exploit, right? So an exposure is anything that exposes us to some risk, which we'll also talk about. A loss is when you lose access to data, or you lose data, or you lose assets, and so forth and so on. Your security posture is basically an objective way to look at your exposure and how you're exposed to attack. So a security posture is how well you're protected and how well you're able to implement that confidentiality and integrity and availability that I talked about earlier. A risk is the likelihood that any of these things is going to happen. So the risk is when we think about all the different ways that we can be attacked and what the likelihood of that happening is, and what our loss is going to look like. In other words, how much is it going to cost us? What's going to be the effect on our organization? You'll frequently see the term subject and object when we're talking about attacks and we're talking about protecting things in our IT security infrastructure. So the subject is who is basically who's carrying out the attack. The object is the thing that we're trying to protect, or the thing that they are attacking would be the object. And the threats, so there's lots of different kinds of threats that we're going to talk a little bit about some of that in this unit. But threats are those things that are going to cause those things that are going to cause a loss of our assets. And threats, by the way, don't have to be just people. So the threat agent are the things that are going to carry out those attacks, or that are going to cause the loss and so forth. And they don't have to be just people and hackers and software. It could also be natural disasters, power failures, and things like that. Again, all of that stuff could affect availability. So in IT security, having infrastructure that can support the organization effectively and helping protect us against power failures and natural disasters is an important part of IT security. And vulnerabilities are the things that would allow some of this stuff to happen. And again, we'll talk more detail about vulnerabilities in another slide deck in this unit. So, characteristics of information. You have availability, accuracy, authenticity, confidentiality, integrity, and utility. So availability is whether you can access the data when you need it. Accuracy is the data being correct, being trusted. Authenticity is who created the data. Confidentiality is making sure that only the people that should have access to it have access to it. We talked about integrity and trust earlier. And utility is that the data is useful, that it has some use to the organization, or it's in a useful state, I should say. So we'll talk more about some of that stuff later on. But these are some of the characteristics of information. CNNS is a framework for, or a set of standards for IT security. Your book talks in great detail about CNNS. There are other frameworks that you can also look at, like SANS has frameworks for IT security. NIST has frameworks for IT security. ISACA, NIS squared. Even CompTIA has some light frameworks for IT security. But again, your book discusses CNNS, so there's quite a bit of a discussion in Chapter 1 in the textbook. I certainly encourage you to go ahead and take a look at that. Some of the components of information systems. Information systems always consist of software, hardware, data, people, and procedures and networks. So these are the 6 components of almost any information system. So almost all information systems contain software. They're all going to have hardware. Some of it may be virtualized, but somewhere under the hood there has to be some hardware to support it. We always have data, which is probably one of our biggest assets in most organizations. We have people, which are going to use that data. People are going to protect it, people who are managing it, and so forth. Procedures, which are part of policies, and then finally networks, which are going to facilitate basically sharing that information between different systems. So those are some of the components. Finally, we have to talk about balancing information security and access. And so we're always to have this balancing act between information security and access to information. And some people in IT security take a very adversarial stance on access to information. IT security is always thinking about how to secure and protect, where everyone else is trying to access that data. And it's important for us in IT security to make sure that we balance the protection of data versus the accessibility or availability. And as I said before, there's the CIA triad. It's not just confidentiality and integrity that we worry about in IT security. We also have to be worried about availability, and far too many people in IT security, I think, forget about the availability portion or the availability responsibility that we have to our users in our networks. The example that they show here in the textbook is the CISO saying that encryption is needed to protect secrets of the organization. I think we can all agree that encryption is good. Encryption is going to protect our organization. But then users might say encryption is a hassle. Encryption takes a long time. I don't have time to worry about encryption. And they're going to be, they're not going to want to implement that. So it's this kind of constant battle, this back and forth to weigh the protection and the confidentiality and the integrity, to weigh all of that stuff against that availability. And sometimes it's hard for us to walk that line. But it's important. And I always tell people that work in IT security that we always want to think about the availability because it's so easy to forget about that. Anytime we're trying to restrict access to some resource, we have to think about, okay, not only do I have to restrict access to this resource, but I also have to make sure that the people who need access to it are always going to have access to that resource as well. So we can't just think about restricting, we also have to think about allowing access to different resources. All right, in the next presentation, I'll talk about some of the methodologies of implementing and maintaining information systems as far as security goes.